The hum of the archive lights was the sound of a government secret dying. But I found something worse. A ledger that listed my own father as an active asset in a vast, dark network. Now, hunted by the shadows he created, the only way to save my family is to bury the truth in the bottom of the harbor. The fluorescent lights of the municipal archives always hummed at the exact frequency required to induce a migraine. I hated this place. It smelled of decaying paper, dry rot, and the faint metallic tang of old government secrets nobody cared about anymore. I was there for a reason only my history professor, Dr. Alistair Finch, knew. A deep dive into zoning disputes from the late 1990s for my dissertation on local infrastructure collapse. Boring, I know, but necessary for that coveted distinction. It was nearly 9 p.m. The main doors had been locked hours ago, but I had special after-hours clearance, a brittle plastic badge Finch secured for me. The security guard, a man named Stan who communicated exclusively through grunts and the rustle of his cheap crisps bag, had promised to stay stationed near the main lobby, probably asleep, judging by the snores I'd heard echoing down the main hall earlier. I was deep in Sublevel B, the section marked Sensitive Administrative Records, Access Restricted. This wasn't zoning maps. These shelves were overflowing with binders marked with cryptic codes, Project Chimera, Operational Oversight Delta, and things that looked like accounting ledgers from defunct construction firms. Finch had hinted that some of the rapid, questionable land acquisitions back then might have involved undue influence, maybe even kickbacks. He never said what kind of kickbacks. I pulled a heavy, unlabeled beige box from shelf 4B11. It was heavier than it should have been, sealed with brittle, yellowed tape. As I gently pried it open with the edge of my archival spatula, a ridiculously formal tool for this kind of break-in, I felt a sudden, cold dread settle in my stomach. This wasn't zoning. This was something else entirely. Inside, nestled between layers of tissue paper that crumbled at the slightest touch, wasn't paper at all. It was a collection of high-resolution photographs, glossy and disturbing. They weren't architectural, they were surveillance stills. People meeting in shadowy parking garages, exchanging items that looked suspiciously like briefcases filled with cash, and worse, images of men I recognized. My breath hitched. The first face stared back at me from a picture dated June 1998. It was Mayor Thompson, the man who'd built his entire political platform on transparency and community trust. In the photo, he wasn't shaking hands with a constituent. He was leaning into the window of a black sedan, his face tight with what looked like fear or greed. I flipped through more. There was Mr. Henderson, my high school principal, standing guard over a warehouse entrance. Then, the truly sickening realization dawned as I saw a familiar figure standing in the doorway of what looked like a clandestine meeting room, a place where illicit deals were clearly being struck. It was my uncle, David. David, who always had the best stories, the most generous gifts for my birthdays, the man who bankrolled my sister's college tuition when my parents struggled. David, who ran a successful logistics company. The photos showed him not directing trucks, but standing over crates stamped with symbols I couldn't decipher, surrounded by men in dark suits who looked less like business associates and more like enforcers for some organized scheme. My hands started to tremble so violently, I had to place the box down on the dusty metal cart. This wasn't just local corruption. This felt bigger, darker, the kind of mess that ended careers, or worse. The feeling of dread intensified into something sharp and metallic in my mouth. I needed to catalog this, to get copies, to show Finch. But the sheer weight of the evidence, the implication of everyone I knew being tied up in something so profoundly wrong, paralyzed me. I quickly started photographing the documents with my phone, the faint light of the screen reflecting off the glossy paper. One specific ledger caught my eye. It wasn't a record of payments. It was a personnel file, thinly disguised. It listed names, dates of induction, and next to each entry, a code word. I scrolled down the list, my heart hammering against my ribs, hoping desperately not to see a familiar name. And then I saw it. My father's name. Not just his name, but a detailed entry. Robert J. Miller. Status, active asset. Role: financial conduit, low profile. Date of initiation: March 1997. My father, the mild-mannered accountant who worked late filing taxes for small businesses, the man who lectured me about honesty and integrity until I memorized the Ten Commandments. How could he be listed here, an active asset in what was clearly some deeply embedded criminal network? I snatched up the page, my mind screaming, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a mix-up. Maybe there was another Robert Miller. But the file listed his date of birth, his former address. It was him. I was about to shove everything back into the box when I heard it. Not the rhythmic snoring from Stan the guard, but a distinct, heavy clunk from the main staircase leading down to sub-level B. Someone was coming. Panic seized me. I couldn't be caught here with these documents, especially not with my father's name on them. I slammed the ledger shut, grabbed the beige box, and frantically shoved it back onto the shelf, praying the poor lighting hid the fact that I'd moved it. I backed away from the row, my eyes darting towards the narrow aisle that led back towards the elevator bank. The floorboards above me creaked under heavy, deliberate footsteps. Whoever it was, they weren't shuffling like Stan. They were moving with purpose. I flattened myself against the metal shelving unit, trying to disappear into the shadows cast by the single emergency light flickering near the fire exit sign. I held my breath, listening, every nerve ending screaming. The footsteps stopped right at the head of the aisle, just feet away from where I was hiding. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow and controlled. Then, a voice, low and dangerously calm, cut through the silence of the archive. I know someone is down here. You've moved the inventory. That box from 4B-11. Don't make this difficult. My blood turned to ice water. It wasn't Stan. Stan would have grunted and asked if I needed help lifting something heavy. This voice was professional, chillingly devoid of emotion, and it knew exactly what I had touched. I'll ask one more time, the voice continued, taking a single, slow step into the aisle, causing the cart I'd been using to rattle faintly. Where are the documents you disturbed? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the shallow, ragged breaths pulling air into my lungs. My mind was racing, but all pathways led to disaster. If I ran, I was caught. If I stayed hidden, I'd be found eventually. I couldn't bring myself to speak. To admit I was here, touching evidence that implicated my own father, felt like signing my own death warrant. I risked a microscopic peek around the edge of the metal shelving unit. The figure was tall, clad in dark, nondescript clothing that seemed designed to absorb all available light. I couldn't make out facial features in the gloom, but the silhouette was intimidating, broad shoulders, an unnerving stillness. This wasn't a rent-a-cop. This was someone sent specifically to guard Project Chimera. My phone, still clutched in my right hand, suddenly vibrated with an incoming call. The screen lit up, blasting a blinding white light into the darkness of the aisle. Unknown number. I'd silenced my ringer hours ago, but apparently I'd forgotten to disable vibration alerts. The man instantly snapped his head toward the light source. In that fraction of a second, I saw enough. A set jaw, cold eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness, and the unmistakable bulge under his jacket that hinted at serious, illegal weaponry. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that defied his bulk, crossing the distance in 2 silent strides. I had milliseconds to react. Instinct, born from sheer terror, took over. I bolted. I didn't run toward the elevator, which would trap me in a metal box with him. Instead, I veered left, crashing past a stack of obsolete microfilm readers, heading for the emergency exit door at the far end of the archive floor. It was the only way out that didn't involve going back through the main security checkpoint. "Stop!" the man barked, his voice losing its soft control, hardening into a command. I heard the heavy thud as he dropped the cart and began his pursuit. He was fast, but the archives were a maze of floor-to-ceiling stacks, creating narrow corridors of tripping hazards and blind corners. I was smaller, fueled by adrenaline, and I knew the layout marginally better than a random operative would, or so I hoped. I rounded a stack labeled 1985 fiscal reports and nearly collided with a rolling ladder. I managed to use it to create a momentary obstruction, shoving it sideways into his path. I heard a grunt of surprise and the crash of metal on metal as he impacted it. That bought me 3 seconds. I reached the steel door of the emergency exit. It was alarmed, designed to sound a deafening klaxon if opened without authorization. But desperate times. I grabbed the horizontal crash bar and threw my entire weight against it. The bar clicked open. A low, throbbing electronic warning began to sound, not the full screaming alarm yet, but a preliminary tone indicating unauthorized egress. I burst through the door and found myself on a narrow, concrete fire escape spiraling down the back of the building. It was outdoors, cold, and blessedly open air, but I was trapped between floors. I didn't look up or down, I just started descending the grating steps 2 at a time, the warning tone echoing sickeningly in the night air. Below me, I could see the perimeter fence bordering the municipal lot, and beyond that, the relative safety of the streetlights. Then, the sound of the heavy outer door closing behind me on sub-level B reverberated through the concrete structure, followed by the distinct, sharp click of the internal alarm finally engaging. The whole building was waking up. I was halfway down the spiral when I heard a new sound, not footsteps on the stairs, but something heavier, more mechanical. I risked a glance upward. Silhouetted against the dimly lit archive window, the operative had bypassed the main stairs entirely. He was somehow moving on the exterior of the building, or worse, he was climbing down using specialized gear. He reached the edge of the landing just above me, dropping down onto the metal grating with sickening ease. He was no longer interested in subtlety. He pulled something out from under his jacket. It wasn't the kind of thing Stan carried in his pocket. It glinted dully under the faint moonlight, a length of cord tightly wound. "You can drop the phone now, kid," he called down, his voice echoing strangely in the confined stairwell. "It's over." I had perhaps 5 steps left to the ground. I could try to outrun him, but if he threw that cord, I was done. In a final, desperate move, I kicked out wildly with my heel, not at him, but at the lowest rung of the metal stairs, hoping to destabilize the structure or at least slow him down. The rusted metal groaned in protest. I hit the ground running, scrambling over the low retaining wall toward the chain-link fence. I dove under the sharp metal points, tearing my jacket, adrenaline masking the pain. I landed on the pavement just as the operative reached the bottom landing. He paused, scanning the perimeter. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the street, praying for a passing car, a light, anything. I reached the curb and looked back. The operative was standing there, illuminated briefly by the street lamp. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking up at the 5th-floor window of the residential building across the street, my apartment building. And then I saw it. Standing on the balcony of my 5th-floor apartment, perfectly still, illuminated by the light spilling from my own living room window, was my father. He wasn't waving. He was just watching the man on the fire escape, as if waiting for a signal. And in his hand, I saw a faint metallic glint that matched the one the operative had been holding. Was my father waiting for me to fail? Was he signaling the cleanup crew? The sight of my father, standing sentinel on our balcony, shattered the last remnants of my rational thought. It wasn't just that he was involved. He was clearly positioned, acting as an observer, maybe even a spotter. The man on the fire escape, the enforcer, didn't seem concerned by my father's presence. In fact, he seemed to acknowledge it with a barely perceptible nod before turning his attention back to me. They were coordinated. They were a unit. And I, holding the damning proof that linked them all to decades of clandestine operations, was the loose end. I didn't wait to see if the operative would give chase again, or if my father would signal him. I ran blindly into the relative anonymity of the back streets. I couldn't go home. Home was now a trap, a surveillance post manned by the very man who was supposed to protect me. My phone. The phone still had the photos. I needed to get to a safe, anonymous place, somewhere with high-speed, untraceable internet. A 24-hour cyber cafe, if such relics still existed in this sanitized neighborhood. I ducked into a narrow alleyway between a closed bakery and a noisy ventilation shaft. The municipal alarm was still blaring. a ridiculous, piercing sound that felt like a spotlight shining directly on me. I pulled out my phone, intending to wipe the data, a failsafe, a temporary measure until I could secure the hard copies. But the screen was frozen. The vibration had done something to the operating system, or perhaps the pursuit had jarred it loose. Worse, the call log was still open, showing the unknown number that had interrupted my work. I had to delete it, but the phone remained unresponsive. "Damn it," I hissed, smashing the side of my palm against the case. Nothing. I shoved the phone deep into the inner pocket of my torn jacket, realizing I was now carrying physical evidence in a box tucked under my arm and digital evidence on a compromised device. I was holding enough information to trigger an investigation that could dismantle the lives of half the city's elite, including my family. This wasn't just about fraud. The nature of the surveillance, the shadowy meetings, the codes, this felt like something that warranted the attention of the highest levels of law enforcement, perhaps even those charged with handling issues related to national security or organized crime structures. A single accusation of involvement with such a severe organization could lead to a very harsh reality, perhaps even decades locked away. I emerged onto a major avenue, forcing myself to walk, not run. Walk like a stressed student running late for a morning class, not a fugitive running from shadows that had suddenly materialized from my own past. I kept my head down, trying to blend into the sparse late-night traffic. I walked for what felt like an hour, circling blocks, checking behind me every 30 seconds. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a paralyzing exhaustion and a gnawing terror. What was I going to do about my father? How could I confront him with the evidence? The man I saw on the balcony wasn't the guy who taught me how to ride a bike. He was a player in a high-stakes game I didn't even know existed. I finally located a dingy establishment called Net Surfer Central on the outskirts of the industrial zone. It was neon lit and smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation. Perfect. I paid cash for an hour on a terminal in the back corner, an area partially obscured by a bank of ancient arcade cabinets. I pulled out the box, its contents now feeling like radioactive material, and laid out the key photos and the ledger page detailing my father's involvement. My first priority was to secure copies of the photographs onto a disposable USB drive. My fingers flew across the keyboard, using the archive's clunky interface to try and bypass security protocols, downloading the images from my phone to the cloud, then onto the secured drive. The process was agonizingly slow. While the transfer crawled along, I focused on the ledger page. I needed to find context for the active asset code. I started cross-referencing the codes with open-source databases relating to historical government contracts and known intelligence monitoring systems. A long shot, but I had Finch's research contacts. 20 minutes in, I found a single obscure reference in a declassified paper concerning intelligence gathering operations in the late 90s, a paper Finch had mentioned once, calling it conspiracy nonsense. The paper detailed a monitoring program used by a now disbanded Internal Affairs Division, designed to track potential high-level penetration by foreign actors or large-scale domestic organized schemes. The ledger codes weren't internal project names. They were classification tiers. Low profile meant he was a money mover, supporting the network financially without direct operational risk. The codes dictated the severity of the potential consequences if discovered. If my father was low profile, who were the others listed as Tier 1 or executive? And what would happen if they realized their financial conduit had turned traitor? The transfer bar on my screen finally hit 98%. Relief flooded me. I pulled out the USB drive, inserted it, and initiated the final copy sequence. Suddenly, the screen flashed bright red. Access denied. System-wide lockdown initiated. The entire cafe seemed to go silent. The arcade machines shut off. The barista, who had been scrolling on his phone, looked up, his expression shifting from bored to alert. My heart hammered against my ribs again. How? This was a private terminal. Then I looked down at the USB drive. The transfer had stopped at 99%. The port had physically rejected the drive, ejecting it onto the desk with a small clink. Before I could even process that I had been locked out, a new window popped up on the screen, taking over everything. It was a simple text document, stark white background, black font. It wasn't a system message. It was a direct communication. You should have stayed in the archives, graduate student. We know you have the originals. We also know you called Dr. Finch 3 times this afternoon. He is currently being questioned by personnel regarding his undue interest in Project Chimera documentation. You have implicated everyone. Now you have one option remaining. Return the box to the drop point listed below in 15 minutes. If you do, we will ensure your father receives only a short stay with us, and perhaps Dr. Finch avoids an even heavier charge than just professional misconduct. Fail to comply, and the consequences will be distributed according to the ledger, starting with the family members who trusted you the most. Below the text was a single address, a decommissioned warehouse on the riverfront. But the real horror was the final line. It wasn't a threat about my father or Finch. It was a personalized message, clearly indicating they had access to my private life beyond the scope of the archival documents. P.S. Your sister's new medication prescription is being managed carefully. Hope she continues to improve. The last sentence, the casual mention of my sister's highly specialized, tightly controlled medication regimen, sucked all the air from the room. It wasn't a threat. It was a demonstration of absolute, terrifying control. They weren't just watching the archives. They were woven into the very fabric of my life, into the fragile health of the person I loved most. My sister had a rare autoimmune disorder. Her stability depended on meticulous scheduling and discreet deliveries. Someone had infiltrated her pharmacy access, her care team, or both. The barista was now standing by my terminal, no longer looking bored, but radiating a cold, predatory focus. He wasn't an employee. He was the welcoming committee. The time limit, 15 minutes, was clearly non-negotiable. I snatched the physical box containing the original evidence, shoved the useless phone back into my pocket, and bolted from the terminal before the man could make a move. I didn't even bother grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. I burst back out onto the avenue, the city lights blurring through my panicked vision. Riverfront warehouse, decommissioned. That meant isolation, darkness, and likely 0 witnesses. It was a perfect trap, designed to reclaim the evidence and silence the source simultaneously. But the thought of my sister, her fragile health leveraged against my compliance, forced my legs into a desperate sprint. I had to go. I had to play their game, at least until I could engineer an escape. I hailed the first passing taxi, throwing myself into the back seat. Riverfront Industrial Sector, Pier 7, quickly. The driver looked skeptical but nodded, perhaps sensing the urgency, or maybe just sensing the desperation of a cash-paying fare. As the taxi sped toward the industrial zone, I pulled out the ledger page again. If I was walking into their stronghold, I needed information. I needed to know why my father was an active asset and what Tier 1 meant for the rest of the names listed, including Finch. If I was going to be swallowed by this network, I needed to know the faces of the wolves I was dealing with. I flipped the page, looking for the context of the codes again, ignoring the faint outline of my sister's name at the bottom of the contact list under Vulnerability Exploitation. My eyes landed on a list of transactions attached to the ledger entry, massive, untraceable transfers routed through offshore holding companies. One company name stood out, linked to the Tier 1 operatives, Ethelred Global Holdings. I didn't recognize the name, but a quick search on the taxi's public Wi-Fi connection yielded results that made my stomach drop into my shoes. Ethelred Global Holdings wasn't just a shell corporation. It was the primary investment vehicle for Senator Marcus Thorne, the political heavyweight currently championing the massive, federally funded infrastructure renewal bill that Finch's dissertation was meant to critique. If Ethelred was implicated in the illicit funding schemes dating back to the late 90s, it meant this network wasn't just local corruption, It was systemic, reaching the highest levels of government, possibly involving illegal financing or misappropriation of enormous public funds. This wasn't just about fixing a zoning dispute. This was about dismantling a political dynasty built on decades of secrecy. And I, armed with beige boxes and paper trails, had just walked into their crosshairs. The cab pulled up to the deserted Pier 7 access road. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, rusted hulk against the backdrop of the dark water. No lights were visible, but I knew someone was inside, waiting. "That'll be $50, the driver said flatly. I paid him, grabbed the box, and stepped out into the damp, chilly night air. The moment the cab pulled away, I was completely alone, surrounded by the sound of lapping water and the metallic groan of the old dock structure. I approached the main loading bay door. It was slightly ajar, emitting a faint sliver of light, a deliberate invitation. I pushed the heavy metal door open just enough to slip through sideways. The interior was vast, echoing, and cold. Dust motes danced in the single bare bulb hanging precariously from the rafters far above. There was no one immediately visible. The air smelled of brine, old oil, and something sharp, like cleaning chemicals attempting to mask something worse. I placed the beige box reverently on an overturned oil drum in the center of the clearing. "I brought what you asked for," I called out, my voice sounding weak and small in the huge space. "The originals. Now, I want assurances about my sister and confirmation that Dr. Finch is safe." Silence. Only the drip, drip, drip of condensation somewhere deep in the rafters answered me. I waited, counting the seconds, the heavy box sitting there like an unexploded device. 1 minute. 2. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Had they bailed? Had I been tricked into delivering the evidence directly to them without any protection? Then I heard movement. Not from the shadows, but from above. I looked up, squinting against the glare of the single bulb. High up in the rafters, near the peak of the roof, I could make out movement. Not one person, but several shadows shifting along the metal beams. They were positioned directly over the drop zone. They weren't waiting for me to leave. They were waiting for me to get close enough to the box. And then, from the direction of the loading bay door I had just entered, a voice spoke, closer this time, amplified by the acoustics of the metal shed. It wasn't the enforcer from the fire escape. This voice was familiar, cultured, and dangerously disappointed. "You truly shouldn't have involved yourself in things you don't understand, son, especially when they involve keeping the family solvent." I spun around. Standing framed in the doorway, backlit by the weak ambient light of the docks, was my father. He was wearing a dark, expensive overcoat I'd never seen before. He wasn't angry. He was merely stating an unfortunate administrative oversight. "Dad, what is this? The ledger—" I started, my voice catching. He took a step into the warehouse, casually brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "The ledger is merely a record of investments, Robert. You misunderstand the nature of loyalty in this business. You were supposed to keep your head down and let the assets do their work." He gestured toward the box on the drum. "Now step away from the evidence, and we can discuss how to manage the fallout from your little archival excursion. We wouldn't want your sister's treatment suddenly requiring a much more rigorous provider, would we?" As he finished speaking, the single bulb above us flickered violently, plunging the warehouse into absolute, crushing darkness. Simultaneously, from the rafters directly above the oil drum, I heard the distinct, sharp thwack of heavy cord being released. The darkness was instant and suffocating, thick enough to chew. The silence that followed the cutting of the light was broken only by the sound of the cord hitting the metal drum, followed immediately by my father's sharp, urgent command echoing from the doorway. "Get him now, before he moves the asset." My survival instinct, honed by the past few hours of sheer terror, bypassed conscious thought. I didn't freeze. I reacted. The moment the cord hit the drum, I knew I was the target, not the box. My father hadn't ordered the enforcers in the rafters to secure the evidence. He'd ordered them to neutralize the threat. Me. I threw myself sideways toward the nearest shadow, not caring where I landed, rolling hard across the concrete floor. As I moved, I heard the heavy thud of boots landing from the rafters, the sound indicating that at least 2 heavily armed individuals had dropped silently onto the floor just meters from where the box lay. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward the far wall, keeping low, using the few unseen pieces of discarded machinery as cover. I needed light, or I needed a distraction that bought me time to reach an exit. I remembered the compromised cell phone in my pocket, the one still displaying the locked screen and the chilling message about my sister. It was a liability, but maybe, just maybe, it was my last-ditch weapon. I fumbled for it, pulling it out just as a beam of tactical light swept across the floor near where I'd been seconds before. The light caught the metallic glint of the box on the drum. "He's moving! Corner him!" my father's voice commanded, closer now. With my left hand, I yanked the phone's power cord, the connection that was supposed to have been secure, and slammed it against the concrete. It wasn't a planned maneuver. It was sheer reflex. The cheap plastic casing cracked, and I heard the familiar, sharp pop of a short circuit. For a glorious, fleeting second, the electrical surge wasn't contained. The small device overloaded, emitting a bright, blinding blue flash and a high-pitched, painful squeal that momentarily overwhelmed the tactical lights and the shouting. That was my window. I didn't look at the box. I didn't look at my father. I launched myself towards the only exit I hadn't used, a smaller side door near the back of the warehouse, meant for administrative access, which I had noted on my initial, terrified sweep. I hit the door, throwing my shoulder against the rusted metal. It flew open into a narrow corridor leading directly to the loading dock where the taxi had dropped me. As I burst into the open air, I heard furious shouts from inside the warehouse. My father must have realized I was escaping, not surrendering. But as I sprinted down the dock, I didn't run toward the main road. I ran toward the edge of Pier 7, where the old derelict fishing trawlers were moored. I knew I couldn't outrun them in a straight race, and they had backup coming from the building. But I had one final, desperate card to play, one piece of information that might buy me leverage. Reaching the edge of the pier, I didn't hesitate. I dropped the heavy box containing the physical proof into the cold, black water of the harbor. It sank instantly, taking decades of criminal enterprise with it, out of reach of my father's immediate grasp. "No, the evidence!" I heard my father scream from the warehouse entrance, a genuine note of panic finally cracking his facade of control. I turned to face the approaching figures, bathed in the harsh glow of their flashlights now spilling out of the warehouse door. My father was among them, his face contorted with rage. "It's gone, Dad," I shouted, my voice shaking but steadying with a strange, cold clarity. "It's all at the bottom of the river now. But the digital trail, the one you just saw me try to upload, that's not gone. And before you send anyone after my sister, you should know I sent an encrypted package to the anonymous tip line of the regional office of the federal investigators this afternoon, before I even went to the archives." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy between us. The package contained the coordinates of this warehouse, a complete transcription of the ledger page listing your Tier 1 contacts, and a detailed analysis linking Senator Thorne's Athelred holdings to the initial funding discrepancies from '98. "You can't clean this up by killing me, Dad. If I don't check in within 12 hours, or if you attempt to interfere with my sister's care, the decryption key for the full file, which is stored in Finch's University safe, will automatically distribute the data to every major news outlet in the country, alongside the primary report that initiated the investigation into the infrastructure project." I had lied about the contents of the USB drive. It had failed to copy completely. But I had fabricated the digital failsafe just moments before, knowing that the immediate threat of widespread exposure was the only thing that could neutralize the immediate threat of violence. My father froze, the rage on his face replaced by a calculating, terrifying realization. He couldn't afford a national scandal right now, not with the infrastructure bill so close to passing. He couldn't afford to eliminate the only person who knew the digital key's location. "You think you can negotiate with this network?" he whispered, taking a slow step forward, his enforcers holding their fire, equally paralyzed by the new threat landscape. "No," I said, backing away slowly toward the water's edge, knowing I was gambling everything. I'm not negotiating. I'm stating the terms of engagement. The evidence is gone, but the knowledge isn't. You let me walk away, you ensure my sister's full recovery without interference, and you ensure Dr. Finch is released unharmed. And you disappear. If I ever see you or anyone associated with you within a mile of my life again, the key releases. This story ends tonight, Dad. With your silence or with total annihilation. I took one last look at my father, the man who had built a criminal empire in the shadows of public trust, and then I turned and melted into the dark, labyrinthine alleys of the riverfront, finally free, leaving the ghosts of the archives sinking slowly into the cold, dark water.